Okay, we're going to start right now. Excellent. Okay, thank you all for coming. As you see, everyone has a sheet. If you don't have one, there's some in the back. It's just one page, double-sided. Double-sided. Okay. So what I hope to do tonight is offer a perspective on Chanukah, which ties into the current events and the crisis of war that the Jewish people in Israel are going through, while offering just a deeper understanding of one of the core messages of Chanukah. And I hope that this idea is as meaningful to you as it is for me, as it was for me. And just before we start, I want to dedicate these words of Torah, like everything we do in the show, all our davening, all our Torah learning is in the merits and of the safety of our soldiers. I personally always have in mind my nephew who went into Gaza for the first time since the war started this past Thursday. So I always think about Benjamin Zev, Ben Rivka, Esther, but I know that's Betoch Shar Chayalim, Hatzadikim, that's all. It's just the name that I grab hold to, but I also have in mind every one of the Chayalim and Chayalot who are in harm's way. And as well for the hostages to be safely returned to their families, for the broken families to have a nechama. And just today, I started focusing on a new thing, something I wasn't sensitive enough until now, which is I read, we talk about the victims of war. We talk about the families that are already bereaved, but we don't focus on enough is the injured ones who are in the hospital recovering. The number today is over 10,000, 10,500, 10,584 are in the hospital today. They're civilians or soldiers as the casualties of war. And when we say, injured, we don't mean like a migraine headache. Like it could be as horrible as a missing limb. It could be traumatic psychological events. It could be people will never be the same, many of them. But that's just something I was more mindful of today, and Bezrat Hashem beyond, is that our Torah and our Tefillah should be in the merit of the full recovery of those who have been injured. And I mean, the number of 10,584 is baffling. How many hospitals filled right now in Israel just of victims of war? So we should have a full recovery as well.
Right.
Okay, so I want to try to capture this idea by asking and trying to go on a journey to answer two questions. One question that I go kind of general, and one more focused within the story of Chanukah. And the one in general is essentially to justify and explain the title that I gave the class. Right? I titled it "The Hardest Chanukah in 2,000 Years." And the question you should be asking on the title is really, was this harder than the Chanukas that were spent during the Holocaust or during the Spanish Inquisition? I mean, there was horrible times in Jewish history, and who are we to come up with a hierarchy? Well, this year is the worst, right? Like, of course, this year is the worst one that I've lived through for sure. But the first clarification I'll give to you is what I don't mean is that I don't mean that this is the Chanukah during the hardest time in Jewish history in the past 2,000 years. What I do mean is that if we do understand the core concept of what Chanukah is, I think what's happening now is the hardest time to really tap in to the message of Chanukah. And we'll see what that means. Okay, but that's first question. The general question is, what do I mean by the title? What do I mean by the statement that this is the hardest Chanukah in 2,000 years? Okay. The second question is a path often taken. The second question is a question which has been asked by many commentators. And you can think of the question as follows. In any Jewish holiday, we summarize all the Chagim, that there was a non-Jewish nation who came to kill us, and they didn't succeed, so let's eat. Right? That's basically our annual calendar, right? That's sorry, there's exceptions, right? And Kippur, etc. But in general, that's our way of life. But in any Jewish holiday, if you look at the origin story, Pesach, Purim, Chanukah, there's often two things which get seen really in the same perspective, which is the story of and the miracle of. And when you could train yourself, or at least to develop this question, to think of those two things as almost separate, you notice something very interesting about Chanukah. Let's take Pesach, for example. What's the story of Pesach? The story of Pesach is that the Jewish people got freed from over 2 centuries of backbreaking, inhumane slavery in Egypt. Right, the whole backstory started in this week's parsha with Yosef going down to Mitzrayim. But that's the story of Chanukah, the great Exodus, the great Yetzias Mitzrayim. What's the miracle of Purim? Yeah, there's many miracles, of course, but the greatest miracle of all is the splitting of the sea. What? Of Pesach, yeah, it was the splitting of the Kriyat Yamsuf. If I take away that miracle, do I still have a story? Yeah. The Jewish people had 10 plagues, and they got to the sea, and all the Jewish people drowned. Right? Except for 2, and there were the future generation of those 2 people, Noach and the Teva type of thing. We wouldn't celebrate that day, right? That's not a story that we celebrate. So the Nes Gadol that was Haya Sham, right, at the Red Sea, is part and parcel of the story of the reason why we celebrate. The Nes was the mainstay of and without the main miracle, you don't have the story anymore. Let's think about Chanukah for a second. Chanukah, we have the story. The story of Chanukah is that there was a small amount of Jews, small amount of Kohanim, really, that were untrained for war. That took, and there was a Hellenistic movement from the Greek Empire to try to not kill Jews, but kill Judaism, right? To secularize everyone and to secularize the Torah. And the Jewish people stood up for themselves with this very ragtag, sad and bad excuse for an army, and we won, right? That's the story of Chanukah. And obviously, we see it in the correct way that it was a miracle as well. That victory is a miracle. We'll get to that in a second. But the real miracle of Chanukah was that they found a little bit of oil that was only enough to last 1 day and lasted 8 days, which was enough for them to get new oil. Now, if I take that miracle away, the miracle of Chanukah, do I still have the story of Chanukah? Absolutely. In fact, that whole sub-narrative, really for us, I think if you ask most kids in elementary school or high school, even adults, the main narrative of lighting the Chanukah and the oil and the miracle that happened is completely extra and superfluous and unnecessary for the historical thing that we're actually celebrating. We're not celebrating the fact that oil lasted longer than it should have, according to nature, because, as I'll show you, that's not really anything we should be celebrating on a religion. I mean, we've had many miracles in Jewish history. We're told in Yeshua, Parak Yud, that Yeshua was in a place called Gilgal right after Yericho, and he needed a little extra time to defeat the enemies. So he said, "Sun, stop." Is what happened. The sun stopped because he needed some more daylight. Do we have an annual day celebrating? We don't have an annual day celebrating that miracle. And we see, look at source number 1. We have tons of miracles, even miracles that have to do with oil that happen in the Gemara. There's actually a few of them. But I just brought one over here. And I'll just paraphrase it outside. But there's a story over here on Arab Shabbos that the daughter of this great rabbi who was actually kind of known as a miracle worker in his day, his name was Chanina ben Dosa. He had all these crazy miracles that he did in the times of the Gemara. Times of the Gemara. And he noticed that his daughter looked sad. And it was Arab Shabbos, it was getting close to Shabbos. So he says, "Biti, amai atzivat, why are you sad?" And she says, "Well, I went shopping today and I've actually bought vinegar instead of oil, and now we don't have candles for Shabbos," and she's very sad. So he says to her, "Why do you, what do you care if it's vinegar instead of oil? Misha Amar l'shemen v'yidlak hu yomer l'chomet v'yidlak." The one who says, Baruch she'amar, the one who says, God, that oil usually lights, so he'll determine that today vinegar will light. And what happened? She lit the vinegar, and it burnt until Havdalah. Little Chanukah miracle in the Dosa family, Chanina ben Dosa, right? We don't celebrate that. I mean, obviously that's it's not something to celebrate. In fact, in source number 2, I just brought what you could open any siddur and see, which is what we've been saying in our benching, Birkat HaMazon, and our Midah, which is the Al Hanisim. Guess what you won't find mentioned at all in the Al Hanisim? Not even once. The miracle of the oil. The entire story that we encapsulate in Al Hanisim is when Malchus Yavan Harasha, when they came against the Jewish people, Lahashkicham Torasecha, Ulavira Michuka Ritzanecha, they came to secularize the Torah of the Jewish people. And what did Hashem do? Hashem Rafta es Rivam Danta es Dinam, and he allowed Rabim Biyad Mi'atim, Tzadikim, Rishonim Biyad Tzadikim, that the many fell to the few, the mighty fell to the weak, and that's the only narrative that we have in the Al Hanisim. We don't find any mention of the candles. Now, curiously, in the Gemara in Shabbos, it does when it says My Chanukah, source number 3. What is Chanukah? What is Chanukah? And there, the Gemara does recount the story of the Pach Shemen, that he found a little bit of oil, and it lasted longer than it should have been intended to. But we do see that in our tefillah, in our davening, we don't mention the oil at all, which to me is very accurate, because having a miracle in Jewish history, what was it, chock full of open miracles in Jewish history. And the Gemara tells us, the Mishnah tells us, that if you went to the Beis HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash for sure, if you went to the first Beis HaMikdash, every single day, just as you're walking in Yerushalayim, you pick up a falafel, on Ben Yehuda, then you walk to the old city, to David Mincha, by the Kotel, right? And if you look just beyond the Kotel, instead of seeing that, my humble opinion, pretty ugly gold dome, right? And you see what was there and what will be there. And you just look, you will see constantly open miracles. For example, one of the examples is you open up your app, your weather app in Jerusalem on your phone, and it says it's a very windy day, right? Very windy. Okay, but then you look at the Mizbeach, where they're throwing on all the sacrifices, all the karbanos, and they're burning all the meat all day. The Kohanim are doing, and there's going to be a pillar of smoke, like a big barbecue. That pillar always went straight up, and it never wavered due to the wind. Open miracle. It doesn't work with nature. You can see that constantly. We don't have a day celebrating the miracle. I mean, miracles are miracles. They used to happen a lot. Now they happen really never. Open miracles that are couched in nature, happen quite often. But open miracles don't happen anymore. So just because in the time of Chanukah they merited to see an open miracle, that's not a reason to celebrate. Really, the reason why we're celebrating is because Judaism lived on. Judaism was at risk because there was a theological warfare being held against Judaism. They wouldn't allow us to practice Shabbos. They wouldn't allow us to practice Rosh Chodesh. And they wouldn't allow us to practice, anyone know the third one? Circumcision. Now, parenthetically, what's so interesting is every Chanukah has a Shabbos. Why? Because Chanukah is 8 days and Shabbos comes every 7 days, right? Okay? Every Chanukah has a Rosh Chodesh, because Chanukah always starts on the 25th of Kislev and goes into Teves. And also every Chanukah, okay, of course, every Chanukah has a bris because the baby's born all the time. But Chanukah is 8 days long, and the bris is after 8 days. Those are the two mitzvahs that happen with 8. The Maharal says famously and beautifully that 7 is the number that always represents nature. There's 7 days of creation, 7 days of the week. There's 7 notes in the musical scale. The 8th is an octave. It's the same as the first, right? What is she? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, back to do, right? And then she says back to do. Is that part of the song, right? Because this is octave. And there are 7 colors in the rainbow, which is a phenomenon of nature, right? The white light going through the prism creates 7 different dimensions of color. So 7 represents nature. 8 represents above nature. That's Chanukah. Bris Milah always. So the very 3 things that the Yevanim, the Greeks, wouldn't allow us to practice are by definition definitively embedded in every Chanukah. It's a beautiful, beautiful realization to have. So there was a war against Judaism, and we defended and succeeded to perpetuate the Jewish bris, the Jewish promise. So that is really what we're celebrating. So again, I'm asking in quite a bit, I admit, a little bit of a roundabout way, what is the role of the miracle of the oil? Why did it happen? And why is it so important for us to encapsulate in our practice of Chanukah year after year, a reflection and a resonance of that miracle? What was the role? What was the point of it? And I think if we can understand the role of it in its time, we'll also understand why it's so important for us to reflect the miracle of the oil every year, and why it's probably arguably the most iconic mitzvah in Judaism right now. I think the most iconic mitzvah in Judaism, right? What's probably the one mitzvah that most Jews fulfill every year? Probably the menorah, Chanukah, something, right? So it's a very iconic mitzvah. Okay. So I think to crack this code and to understand this properly, we have to find the real origin story of the story of Chanukah. we have to find the story of Chanukah in Tanach. Now, if you know anything about Tanach, you'll probably raise your hand and correct me. It sounds like I made a big mistake there. Why is that so? Because when does Tanakh end? Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, where does it end? Chronologically, what is the last narrative, the last story, the last prophecy in the entire book of Tanakh? And that is really three people in tandem at the same time. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And their prophecies, they were the final prophets, final Nevi'im, and they took place right, their era ended right at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash, the second temple, right? The Chanukah story happened about 200 years after, right? 200 years, but just about halfway through the life of the second Beis Hamikdash is when the second Beis Hamikdash lasted for 420 years. Right in the middle of that is when the story of Chanukah happened. So if Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi ended 200 years prior, right at the beginning of the revolution of the Jews moving back to Jerusalem, under the helm of Ezra, bringing the Jewish people back from Babylonia, modern day Iraq, to start building the Beis Hamikdash under the Persian Empire, right? This is at the tail end after the Chanukah story, right? Right after the Chanukah story, the Jewish people got permission to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash in the Persian Empire. And that's when Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were active during that time. They prophesied about the rebuilding of the second Beis Hamikdash and a few things that happened after. And 200 years later, the Chanukah story happened. So how could we find us the story of Chanukah in Tanakh if Tanakh ended before the Chanukah story happened, right? And the trick to understand how we could do this is because Tanakh is not any old history book, because history books only tell us about the past. Tanakh tells us a lot about the past. But what Tanakh also does, by the power of prophecy, of Nevuah, is it also tells us about the future. Right? It tells us about the past and the future. Different, not all at the same time. Sometimes it's past-oriented. If you learn the Nevi'im Rishonim, Yeshua, Shmuel, Shoftim, Malachim, that's all things that happened in the past. But if you learn Nevi'im Achronim, Yechezkel and Yeshaya, you're right, Yeshayahu and Avi, and as well parts of Zechariah, as we'll see, are talking about the future. Okay, with that in mind, turn your page over and look at source 5 together. Source 5 is taken from the Haftorah of this past week in shows around the world. Right, this past week was Shabbos Chanukah, and whenever it's Shabbos Chanukah, we read one of the most beautiful Haftorahs that we read the entire year. But I'll say that about any Haftorah I'm talking about at that time, so you can't trust me, right? The beautiful words from Zechariah Perek Dal, an astounding vision that Zechariah had, and I think you and I could see this in why this prophecy, this nevuah, is chosen to be the Haftarah for Shabbos Chanukah, and hopefully shed a lot of light on, pun intended, on our questions that we started with. So let's start. I bolded the most important parts, but it's only 5 or 6 psukim, so let's see them together. Vayashav hamalach hadover bi, right? This angel who was talking to Zechariah, the prophet, the Navi, came back to me. Vayireni ki'ish asher yer mishasa. He waking me up in with a certain urgency. And he woke me up and he says, "Well, what do you see? What's the vision? What's the dream that I just woke you up from?" Va'omar, and I told this angel, Ra'isi, I saw bihine minorat zahav kula. I saw a menorah which was completely gold, a golden menorah, vigula al rosha, and there was a bowl above the menorah, vishiva neroseh aleha, shiva vishiva mutzakot leneros asher al rosha, and there was lamps that were 7 in number, like these little lamps, a bowl with lamps on top of the bowl, and the lamps each had 7 pipes, almost like a pipeline going down to each branch of the menorah. But he continues in the next pasuk, Ushnaim zeisim aleha, and there were 2 olive trees on top of each side of the menorah. Echad mimin hagula ve'echad al simala, one on the right of the bowl and one on the left. So basically what he's describing is olive branches which lead into a bowl, which lead into spouts, which are, so to speak, leading into each one of the goblets or cups that hold the oil in a menorah. That's his vision, right? What does this whole thing mean? Like, what's this vision? He's asking the angel that's showing him the vision. And the malach, the angel, told him back, Hello, Yadata. Don't you know what this is? And the prophet said back to the angel, no, I don't know what this is. And the angel said back to me, well, it's obviously what this is. It's obvious what this message is. It says, Zed Dvar Hashem El Zerubbabel Lamar. This is the message of this vision that I'm showing you, is a message to give to Zerubbabel, who was like the prime minister of the Jewish people at the time. Right? Remember, the Jewish people were in the Persian Empire at the time. We didn't have sovereignty of Israel. Even when we built the base to make the second temple, we did not have sovereignty of Israel. We were essentially given permission as like a religious culture, society, to build a temple for ourselves where it used to be in the city of Yehuda and Yerushalayim. So just go tell the Jewish representation to the government, Zerubbabel, that's what his name was, this following message, which for some reason is represented with that whole menorah. Lo b'chayo v'lo b'koach. Ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvakos. That not by your might nor by your power will you win or be successful, but rather by my spirit, by my involvement, says God, says Hashem to Zerubbabel. Now, how is that message encoded in the message of the menorah? Now, if you think of the message of the menorah that he saw, what did he see? He saw a menorah, a golden menorah, which has olive branches on either side, which are essentially dripping into a bowl, which is leading into each goblet of the menorah. What is that? Is it, if it's not, commentators explain something beautiful. That is a menorah which is being lit, even though no one is filling it up. There's olive branches. Everything it needs is there. There's olive branches that are there. The oil is being squeezed into the cups, which is filling up. There's no Kohen there. There's not enough oil because no one's putting enough oil in. And therefore, the message turns in for the Navi to tell Zerubbabel, let's call him the pseudo-king for now, right? You have to tell the prophet the message that it's for the Jewish people to live on in the future. This is well before the Chanukah story. That's why Zechariah says, I don't know what this means because he's never seen it. That the message is, it's not about how much oil you put in. It's about how much God wants your oil to last for, right? It's that is the message of this self-filling menorah that Zechariah is seeing. Now, Zechariah is stumped. He has no clue what this means. He takes this message, puts it in his back pocket, tells Zerubbabel, but fine. 200 years later, what happens? That Judaism is the future of Judaism is highly in question as this mighty army seeks to ban Judaism and secularize Judaism as a religion. And there was an amazing thing that happened, which is this tiny ragtag army beat this one of the mightiest armies in the world at the time, an empire. So if the generation of the Chanukah story, what is the reaction of the generation? The news clippings, CNN, BBC, how are they covering the story? There's two possible narratives that could be sold in the news, in the media, in the reaction of the Jewish people after the Chanukah story. Either number one, right, and we've heard people talk like this about the 6-Day War. We've heard this before. It was amazing, genius strategy, which it was, right? I'm not denying that, right? It was genius strategy, certain amount of desperation, right? Like the power of the underdog. When you have nothing to lose, you got to give it your all. You fight harder. We see that in sports all the time, right? So that's one narrative. That there was a mix of luck, good strategy, knowledge of the terrain, right, and desperation created a miraculous win for the underdog. That's narrative number one. Narrative number two is not to take away the validity of all those, but it's a miracle. It was because God wanted it to happen. That's it. And because the Jewish people could have seen the narrative in one of two ways, it's called physical or spiritual. So what does Hashem do? Hashem triggers our memory of that prophecy that was given 200 years prior, 2 centuries prior. And he says, you know what? There's a little bit of oil. The Jews found the oil and they lit it and it lasted longer as if someone was filling it up from above without human interaction, which is exactly the vision of Zechariah. So says the Jewish people, I know what's going on over here. It wasn't because we were more desperate and had better strategy. Lo b'chaya v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi. Those are the words of the Malach, of the angel, talking as a conduit of God to Zechariah the prophet. That it's not lo b'chaya lo b'koach v'lo b'chaya ki im beruchi. It's not up to the might and the strategy and the desperation of the Jewish people, but rather it was because God wanted it to happen. It's not about how much oil you have to put in, it's how much God wants your oil to last for. And therefore, the Jewish people realized that what happened on the war front was actually a religious reality. And therefore, they said, okay, because the miracle of the oil reminded us and made sure we didn't veer away from what actually happened on the battlefront, we have to now perpetuate this day, the Kavu Shmonasim Yamim Elu, and they established these 8 days for all of future history as days of Chanukah. But if it wasn't, yes.
When does the light happens during that story? Is it after they win? Is it
After they win,
battle?
right? Exactly. In fact, we have one of these hints of how we remember when Chanukah starts. Chanu, Chafhei, Chanukah. So Chafhei is Kislev, and Chanu, they rested. They finally had a day of reprieve and rest on the 25th, and then they went in finally free of the onslaught of the enemies to the base of Mikdash, and they found in some under inner annex of the base of Mikdash a tiny little jug of oil that was only enough to fill it once, and then it lasted for 8 days. But the oil lasting for 8 days was like a reminder and a trigger of that prophecy from Zechariah of the golden menorah that filled itself, right? And that's how they knew, what happened. That's how they made sure not to make the mistake that it wasn't just their brilliant Yiddish cup strategy and desperation, right? And the underdog, the power of the underdog, but rather it was Hashem's interaction with the Jewish people. And this story, the reason why I think it was so important for the rabbis in the times of the rabbis at the times of the second base of Mikdash to establish this holiday. Okay, again, it's a holiday which is D'Rabbanan. Purim and Chanukah are unique in that way that we have like a major holiday which is really part of our celebration with the annual calendar, which is not in the Torah, right? It's not in the Torah. It doesn't say every Kislev, every Kislev to celebrate Chanukah because it's way. But the rabbis felt that this message that's encapsulated in the story of Chanukah is so important for the future of the Jewish people. We have to make sure to establish an annual holiday because this story of Chanukah has happened since Chanukah so many times. 1948, exactly the same thing. You had a bunch of ragtag Holocaust survivors that, Rav Amital used to say that at least the starting point for a good battalion, a good unit in the army, is you got to be talking the same language, right? They literally, there were battalions in 1948 that didn't talk the same. Yiddish speaker, you had a German speaker, you had a Hebrew speaker. Not everyone spoke Hebrew. And it was like, there was no such thing as modern Hebrew. That was all since 1948. Some knew Hebrew, some spoke Polish, and Yiddish and German. But they hardly could communicate with each other, let alone know how to fight. How do they know how to fight? They didn't know how to fight. And they were going up against huge armies from all our cousins from all sides, right? And the Milchemet HaShachur was either the underdog story or it was a miracle because God realized that Jewish history could not go one more day without the state of Israel. So he established the state of Israel through this army that was probably just as well qualified as the skinny and weak Kohanim that were serving in the base of Mikdash in the time of Chanukah. Same exact story, right? Same exact story. And 1967 again, the Jewish people had a little bit more strategy by 67. We had our own weapons and we had the IDF by then, but still nothing compared to the numbers and the strength we were going up against. And the same story happened again, that Rabbim fell towards Ma'atim and Giborim fell beyond Chalashim. It was the same exact, the Al Nisim story happened again in 67. It happens time. It happened time and time again in Jewish history. Therefore, if you look up on Google, it's amazing. If you look up on Google, where the emblem of Israel came from. So you'll find that in 1948, there was like 150 different iterations and submissions of what the emblem, if you've ever lived in Israel, anytime you get a letter from the government, usually to ask for money, right? It's for something, a parking ticket, not that I wouldn't know about those, right? But or taxes or anything, any official form in the government has this emblem. This is the emblem of Israel, right? And there's different, if you look on Google, they'll say, well, olive branches represent peace. So you have olive branches, and the menorah represents the Jewish heritage, now old. The Jewish people are indigenous for thousands of years. The base of Mikdash in Yerushalayim, which is probably all true. But the people who founded the state of Israel knew Tanach really well. And what you're looking at is a menorah with two olive branches around it, which is the vision from Zechariah that we read on the Haftorah, on Shabbos Chanukah as the Haftorah. You're basically looking at a country that's saying at its inception that we are aware of lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi, that our success isn't going to be found in our prowess of war and our strategy, but rather is going to be because Hashem realized that the Jewish history cannot go one more day without, in 1948, the state of Israel, one more day in 1967 without having Yerushalayim, the center of Yerushalayim, under Jewish sovereignty in hands. And it's because Hashem wants the Jewish people's history to continue to develop and go in the right direction back to Yerushalayim. That is what brings the Jewish people success, right? And I think that is such a powerful take and realization that the story of Chanukah is so deeply connected to the vision of Zechariah, and that message of lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki beruchi is part of the very identity of the success of Israel, the success of the modern state of Israel, the success of the Jewish people. Now, why do I say that this is the hardest Chanukah in 2,000 years? Because, I mean, when the Jewish people aren't at war, so Chanukah is an important message, and it's cute, and it's meaningful, and it's very important. But I feel like that when the Jewish people are at war, I mean, this year in particular, Chanukah becomes such a spiritual, so important, and invigorates our emunah and our faith that this will all go in the right way. But it's much harder to connect the message of Chanukah to the war that the Jewish people are fighting today. Because for once in history, this is the first time, right, in modern Jewish state history, that the Jewish people are not the underdogs. Like, we finally get a chance to have the Vegas odds on us. It's the first time in the history of the, when else have Jewish people have never, I mean, since the times of David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech, right, and Shaphat and the Achav was a very strong. He had a very strong army. Wasn't a righteous king, but he had a very strong army for the Jewish people. In the times of the prophets, of the Nevi'im, of Malachim, of the kings, that was the last time in history since the Jewish people have been exiled after the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. Today is the first time that the Jewish people are not the underdogs against them, which is unbelievable to think that, right? So how does the story of Chanukah give us an invigorated faith, emunah, when the whole story of Chanukah is designed that the underdog, right, and you win, don't think that was your strategy, but rather it's God. It's much harder to see God. It's relatively easy to see God in the victory of the underdog because you weren't supposed to win. But when you are supposed to win because you're not the underdog, the message of Chanukah becomes a lot harder, but also a lot more important, because we have to remember, we have a lot of faith. We believe so much. And this message is not to belittle, God forbid, Khalila, the efforts of the IDF and our belief in their strategy and their organization. We believe wholeheartedly that we need to put in that hishtadlus, that effort, and we're blown away by the power that the Jewish people have been able to build in only 75 years with intelligence and technology and high tech all being woven together to create the unbelievable Israeli defense forces that we have today. But with all that said, it becomes a lot harder to see God in the picture, right? Secular Jews, there was no Chanukah story in 1948, 1967, right? Because they just see the strategy and the underdog story. And today, I think less, because I think there is in Israel at least, definitely a religious awakening in Israel happening, that people are seeing God in what's happening, realizing that tens of thousands of Hamas terrorists have been killed. And our casualty rate, we wish it was zero. Every casualty in war is a whole entire world. And it pains us and it kills us. But you understand, when's the last time a war has been fought in the war where you have 10,000s against 100 in terms of casualty trading in war? I mean, what we're seeing is a tremendous success for the Jewish people. Now, do we see God there? Do we see the Chanukah story? It's a lot harder to see this for the first time in 2,000 years. Very hard to see God in that because of our power and our strategy and the perfection that the IDF has in its ability to see war and win this war. So it becomes a lot more difficult to see Hashem, but all that more important as well. I want to bring up one other nevuah which I love, which is not known so well. In Divrei Hayamim, this is already going back earlier, much earlier than the Chanukah story. but it's a very powerful encapsulation of the same message. Over here, we have a Navi. His name is Yachziel. You can't even Google him. You know why? He's got the worst SEO rating, search engine optimized. If you type in Yachziel Hanavi, literally Google corrects you to Yechezkel Hanavi. Right? He's got no. This is actually the only time, the only nevuah that I'm aware of that Yachziel Hanavi Yachziel comes up. And it was during the times of Yehoshaphat, and Yehoshaphat was being attacked, I believe, by Ammon at the time, and the army was huge compared to the Israeli to Yehoshaphat, the king of Israel's army. And he was so nervous. If you took him before I quote over here, he actually calls for a national fast because he's so nervous about what's going to happen and where everyone's fasting, for him, and he's going. And then he asks the Navi, Yachziel, what's going to happen? And then Yachziel reminds him, Koam, this is in the beginning of the first pasuk I quote over here. Ko Amar Hashem, so says God, lachem to you. Atem, you guys, al tiru ve'al techatu. Don't be afraid. Don't be nervous. Mipnei ha'hamon harav, the great nation that's in front of you. Why? Ki lo lachem hamilchama, ki le'elokim. The war is not for you to win, it's for God to win. Now go fight like your life depends. He wasn't saying, therefore go home and watch TV and watch Netflix and let the war just fall by itself. No, you guys have to come up with the best strategy and you have to fight. But through that fight, this is the hardest job to do. If you sit back, relax, and let the sea split, great. You could see God very easily. But go put your all into it and fight. And through that, see that your success is going to come from God. That's the hardest thing to see in life. And I think that is really what we're being asked to do through Chanukah, through this war, is even though it's a little bit backwards compared to the Chanukah story, and therefore a lot harder to see the miracles, to see the Yad Hashem, to see the hand of God in the success of today's war, but it becomes all that more important because the integral message of Chanukah, harkening back to 200 years prior, the prophecy of Zechariah, which lo b'chaya v'lo b'koach ki im berochi, that your success won't be through your might, your prowess in war, but rather through me, says God. And that literally became that message. Right? Zechariah saw that message of the menorah and asked the Malach, the angel, what does that mean? And the angel responded, Lo b'chayil, v'lo b'koach ki beruchi, which that vision literally became the emblem of the state of Israel. So no matter what the scale is of the war, underdogs or the heavy favorites, we always have to be able to see the message that through divine inspiration, our forebears came up to define the Jewish nation in the emblem, which is that same message that Zechariah got about 3,000 years ago from that Malach, which got repeated in the Chanukah story and repeated again in 48 and 67 and every war since then. And finally, we have the opportunity not to be the underdog, but we can't allow being the stronger of the side sacrifice the core message that we're meant to carry through Chanukah, which is the success doesn't come from us, but rather the success comes from Hashem. So with that, we ask Hashem to bring our success so we don't have to have any more casualties and no more injuries, and we can finally have those captives return to their family. Chanukah Sameach.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Time maybe would be to not just wait because wait this one.
Right.
Oh, but to have peace. I mean that the result is better than
Right.
what we had before. Something comes out of it.
Right. Yeah.
Difficult is to see God on October 7th.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult. But you're pointing out a very powerful point as well, which is yes, the war against Hamas, the Jewish people are the favorites, but what happens next? What happens in Gaza next? What happens to the north? And to the south and to the east of Israel, of the aftermath. So, when you add up all those parts, it could be with the underdogs again. Like, how is this going to land in a peaceful way? So, yes, the Chanukah story in its regular setup is still meaningful in the Tvach Aruch, in the long perspective. But in the moment, I think it's more of a challenge to see God counterintuitively, but specifically because we're not the underdogs anymore. Yeah.
How do you see God in October 7th?
I don't have an answer to that. That's asking, where was God in the Holocaust? It's only those silly enough to even attempt to try to answer that question are just going to humiliate themselves. I mean, the answer to that is, there's a powerful Gemara in the Talmud where it's even in the Torah where Moshe asks Hashem to see his face in Parshas Kisisa. Let me see your face. And he says that you can't see my face, but you can see my back. In the Gemara, the Talmud says he showed him the tefillin in the back of God. What does that mean? God doesn't wear tefillin. It's all a metaphor. Obviously, it's not physical. But what it means is that we can never actually have the access to see God's ways. We get hints of things, and sometimes we see them in the world, sometimes we don't. But we'll never be privy to everything. Never privy to everything. Parents never see. Children never get to understand their parents perfectly in all their interactions, all the ways. Sometimes when they get older, they understand things that they didn't understand when they were younger. But still, you never completely understand it. So with that, to the infinite vector, the humanity is never designed to understand all of God's ways. So we try to take from our well of emunah, of faith, to not come to a place that we're denying God's existence because of what we're seeing. But obviously, it could be a struggle sometimes, for sure.
So Chanukah is not. It's not on the same level of the Shalosh Regalim.
Right.
It's like
It's Dirabanan, it's rabbinic, correct.
So they chose that. Bar Kochba he didn't have a miracle, but is he not celebrated because he was a loser, not a winner?
Well, he was like he could be, would be, could have, should have, but didn't, right?
But he was also very gallant,
Yeah.
effort. So why did they pick Chanukah but not Bar Kochba?
He didn't change Jewish history. He wasn't his generation wasn't successful at preventing what the enemies wanted to do to us at the time. So that's it. He was a great man. Rabbi Akiva thought he was Mashiach. Rabbi Akiva was wrong. Yeah. Okay. Good. Very good. Yeah. Happy Chanukah. Should be successful. One for all of us. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.